go vote, show up. From your neighbor to City Hall. Reach out, go vote, show up. Serving people is what it's all about. Reach out, go vote, show up. Frankfort civic proud. Speak up, reach out, go vote, show up.
From Capitol Halls to Bourbon Balls, this is the City of Frankfort's podcast for the Frankfortians. We're swapping stories, spilling the tea, and celebrating the quirks that make Kentucky's capital the best hometown around. I'm Dr. Ellie Hasken-Wagner, or Dr. Ellie, and today you just get me. So this is going to be a pretty exciting episode, and we'll be talking about the history of Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Frankfort. If you haven't heard of the March on Frankfort, this is a very apropos episode because this is the week of the MLK, Martin Luther King Jr. Day. So we're taking time this week to think about the ways that our country has changed due to the influence of people like Martin Luther King Jr. And he has had an incredible influence here in Frankfort, Kentucky, and in the state overall. And this is a complicated story. So you're not going to learn everything in this podcast episode, and there might be some things that I kind of breeze over or that I don't go in as much depth as you might want. And that is by no means an intentional omission, other than to try and give folks who have never heard of this before just a nice entry point into these stories. Frankfort is not a perfect community by any means, especially when it comes to history of race relations. If you've been on the famous Russ Hatter Murder and Mayhem tour, which I am now shepherding, you'll hear stories about crimes of racial violence that are really hard and harrowing and happened here in our hometown. And that's not uncommon for any southern state or northern state to have experienced in the 1800s and 1900s. But we are very lucky that we have incredibly pivotal moments of power and meaning and placemaking that occurred here to help advance the efforts of equality in the United States and in the state of Kentucky. That's part of the joy of being the capital city, is that we get to be intimately involved in some of the things that change our entire landscape. So this episode looks really, really closely at the MLK March as it happened here in Frankfort, Kentucky. And the Capital City Museum, which is open Monday through Saturday from 10 to 4, has an exhibit that details not only photographs from the March on Frankfort, but also has a repeating loop of videos from director Joanna Hay that go into this history more in depth. Those are also available online through the City of Frankfort's website, dedicated explicitly to the March on Frankfort, and it's sites.google.com/frankfort.ky.gov/March on Frankfort. So you can learn more about it there, and I'm positive our showrunners will be amazing and link this resource to this episode overall. In addition, as we go into this, I do want to do a shout out to a project that the City of Frankfort did several years ago that was spearheaded by Vicki Bierenberg to look at a historic context of African American history, specifically related to architecture and place here in Frankfort, Kentucky. And that's also available on the city's website for free, and there's printed copies at the museum that you're welcome to come take a look at. We don't have them for sale at the museum. It's a rather large document, so I do recommend downloading it and checking it out on your own time because it has a really extensive history. Okay, we've done that preamble stuff. Now we're going to get into the real meat of this episode, and we're going to talk about what it was like to be a Black person in Frankfort in the mid-20th century. It's probably not surprising that it wasn't always easy, and it was incredibly difficult at times. And in fact, in the 1950s, a series of very currently debated decisions were made about how to handle a predominantly Black neighborhood called Crawfish Bottom, better known as the Craw or the Bottom. And this neighborhood was actually slated to be demolished as part of an urban renewal program that the city instigated in the 1950s. At this time, what the city did was they purchased the buildings that were occupied by renters. The owners of these buildings were mostly white, and the folks who rented them were a mix of Black as well as white residents, but many of them didn't have enough money to own their own homes. So they were unfortunately and horrifically kicked out of these places that they considered their homes, while the owners of the buildings sort of profited. It was eminent domain, so they got money for these homes, and they had to relocate to new places. Now, after the homes were purchased, as part of the urban renewal program, they were demolished and they were turned into what became known as Capitol Plaza. And the Capitol Plaza Hotel is still standing, and it's a really good kind of remnant of the type of architectural style that we saw during this urban renewal period here, especially in Frankfort. Now, setting aside the Capitol Plaza, of which the museum's podcast, Any Old Place, actually goes really in depth on, this is a really pivotal time in Frankfort history because it saw the relocation of a predominantly Black working class neighborhood to be displaced throughout the city. And at this time, segregation was still in place, specifically in the early 1950s. And it wasn't until 1955, when desegregation began, that we saw real movement in the changes of the contemporary downtown landscape. Now, what this looked like was we also lost a solely Black high school called Mayo Underwood High School that was located on the north side of Frankfort in the Crawfish Bottom neighborhood. And as integration began, Black students started to move into formerly white schools like Frankfort High, and we saw a change in the social dynamics for students who were Black, had been used to being in classrooms with Black instructors and other Black students, and now they were in an environment with white students who, for better or worse, had lived a life of privilege, especially in comparison to their Black co-students who were now adjusting to an entirely new environment, an entirely new school. Now, that's not an argument against desegregation, but it's just the reality of the situation. And as these students were accumulating to this new environment, they were also seeing desegregation in restaurants. And a lot of that was happening here in Frankfort thanks to the work of the NAACP, which was really extremely shepherded by the Holmes, Helen and BT Holmes. Now, Helen and BT were amazing people. They did a lot for our community overall, and they worked so hard as the leaders of the NAACP to really bring awareness and information and protests to the act of desegregation. So to take a look at this time period, and I'm going to be referencing some notes here that were compiled by both former city historian Russ Hatter, but also by this African American context report that I mentioned earlier. As leaders of the NAACP, or the National Advancement for Colored People, both BT Holmes and Helen Holmes worked in really difficult situations to bring about protests, sit-ins, multiple walkouts, anything that they could possibly do in order to end eras of segregation in a lot of really critical Frankfort institutions. So among their work, they brought about the end of segregation in many of Frankfort's local restaurants, the Frankfort Public Library, the King's Daughters Hospital, which is a huge deal, and they worked to help integrate not only local police officers, but also regional and statewide officers. So at the end of the 1950s, we saw multiple acts being passed by Governor A.B. Chandler to desegregate the state police officers, as well as desegregate multiple state offices. So the Holmeses were incredibly important people in the act of organization and information, as well as really trying to push for the continued advancement here in our community. And as the 1950s are coming to a close and we're going into the 1960s and we're seeing desegregation happening, we're hearing a lot of really complicated and challenging stories about the Black experience in Frankfort. Now, there's advancement, as I've said, but there's also areas where this advancement is bringing up around challenges. So one of the first Black students to integrate into Frankfort High School is named Kermit Williams. Kermit Williams is an incredibly important person in not only Frankfort history, but also national history, because he was the cover of Time Life magazine in 1956 for his role in helping to integrate Frankfort High School and becoming the first Black student to go on record for scoring a touchdown at a desegregated school. Now, again, that's a huge victory, and I'm by no means trying to undermine that, but Kermit Williams bravery in being on this team was not without difficulties and challenges. So there's a story that I've heard verbally many times about how the first time he took the field as a Frankfort High School player, the cliffside next to the football stadium had 3 crosses alit on top of it. And if you're familiar with the KKK or other white supremacist organizations, this is a declaration of white supremacy in the United States. And so this was something he faced as a young person walking onto the football field to play a sport that he loved. And to continue to do that in the face of something that is that pointed is an incredible act of bravery that was occurring here in Frankfort. So the role of Kermit Williams in our history is not to be downplayed by any means, because to do that and to continue to step forward and be the face of something that was creating a new space for people is really powerful. And this was in 1956. So again, we're nearing the end of the 1950s here in Kentucky, and there's advancements happening thanks to folks like B.T. and Helen Holmes and Kermit Williams, but there's still difficulty, there's still pushback, there's still slurs, there's still violence, there's still crimes, and it is not an easy life to live, even in an area that's known for being as progressive as Frankfort was. So another interesting thing happens in the end of the 1950s that sets the stage for the March on Frankfort happening here in Kentucky. And if you're unfamiliar with this, Frankfort is home to K-State University, or Kentucky State University, at the time, Kentucky State College. And this university now is a historically Black university here in Frankfort. And as a historically Black institution, and as a Black-only institution in the 1950s, it probably is not necessarily a shock, but still sets the stage for what's to come, that Martin Luther King Jr. does the commencement address for the 1957 class at Kentucky State. So this is after integrations occurred, and MLK is here in town to do a commencement address. And at the time, he's also working to lobby with people in state government to try and bring about continued desegregation and integration policies here in the state of Kentucky. And this is successful. We do see K-State actually becoming a larger institution in our community at the time. We see an increased role for K-State here in Franklin County. They're gifted more land, they have purchased more land, and more land in the county is annexed to K-State for the completion of academic programs, specifically around agriculture, as they're a growing agriculture institution, and now they're one of the best known schools for aquaculture in the United States. So, end of the 1950s, going into 1960s, there is continued change here in Frankfort and Franklin County regarding civil rights, but there is nothing necessarily as critical as the Frankfort Board of Education desegregating elementary schools. So we've talked about the high school desegregation that occurred in the 1950s, but in 1962, it's voted that children from Black families are allowed to enroll in Second Street School as well as Murray Street School. So if this ends up going well, then the middle schools will become desegregated too. And there were multiple lawsuits around this decision, and specifically lawsuits related to the closure of Murray Street School, which was a predominantly Black school. But it continued on, and desegregation and integration continued to kind of hold the course. And in 1964, we see, in January of 1964, the state convenes session. And we're in session right now, so it feels really fitting to talk about this. And at the time, there were several bills that were on the table that would advance equality in Kentucky. And these were really critical bills that would really set the stage for how folks in the state of Kentucky would interact with one another. So even though desegregation is happening and it's moving into this good future of equality, it's still not as strongly held as important as we would want it to be. So moving into the 1960s, we're seeing a continued shift in desegregation policies in the United States and throughout Frankfort and the state of Kentucky. And what we're seeing happening is this call for legislation around the formal legislated desegregation of public spaces in the United States. And so Kennedy is president in the early 1960s, and he is running on a platform of desegregation and civil rights. He's calling for it as a moral issue. It's something that we all need to work towards. But his assassination cuts that bill short. And so, not permanently, but it does delay its passing, as well as kind of put something else at the forefront. In the interim, in 1963, Kentucky has created a coalition of folks to determine whether or not Kentucky needs its own Civil Rights Act, if there needs to be some legislation that's passed to help continue the act of equality in the state of Kentucky. And this group, who meets in 1963 around the morality issue and research and kind of like reference for this equality, is called the Kentucky Human Rights Commission. It's still a commission that exists today. It's probably something you've even heard of. But this commission found that there were over 400 motels, hotels, lunch counters, drugstores, and other public accommodations that provided equal service to people of any race in the state of Kentucky. 400 out of hundreds of thousands, whereas everything else was still segregated, or at least had policies of segregation. Whether or not they were acted on is probably a different issue, but those policies still existed. So in 1963, there was a significant call for legislation that would 100% formalize civil rights in the state of Kentucky. And as session began in January of 1964, this was the hot button issue. Everybody was talking about it. And the Kentucky General Assembly knew that this bill was going to be entered into consideration. But before that could even really happen, Governor Edward Breathitt indicated that he would wait until Congress, the United States Congress, passed their own legislation before he would sign any bill bringing civil rights to the state of Kentucky. So he was waiting for a federal mandate before he passed a state mandate. And this is really due to the social pressures of being a southern state or a border state in this conflict. And it honestly is also due to the folks who were talking to him about why this was still something that needed to wait. And as a political official, he wanted to make sure that he was on the right side of history. And we know now that he was, but at the time it was still kind of up in the air for white political officials. I just want to be clear, for white political officials. They wanted to have a platform that they could continue to run on. And for Breathitt, that meant playing it safe. So even though Breathitt was not going to sign anything into formal law until Congress had passed their own legislation, multiple bills were still introduced into the House and the Senate during the legislative session for consideration. And these bills had multiple points of consideration, and they were thought about in different ways. For instance, the Allied Organization for Civil Rights, or AOCR, thought that the bills that were put forward were some of the weakest ones that had been passed in 32 other states, none of which had been in the South at this time. The bills that had been passed were mostly northern states for civil rights, but in the southern states, all of those bills had failed. And the AOCR believed that Kentucky's legislation was going to be the weakest passing. They said that the bill eliminated many types of businesses because it didn't explicitly mention them. So, for instance, businesses that weren't mentioned in the Civil Rights Act included bowling alleys, roller skate rinks, golf courses, amusement parks, dance halls, boat docks, and swimming pools. They also noted that earlier legislation that had been recommended by the Kentucky Human Rights Commission included those areas for integration, and that it had obviously been removed in the more recent acts that had been introduced. So going into session in 1964, all of this was on the table. And in early session, it was very obvious what was going to come to pass. As I'm sure many of us know now, if we follow session at all, it's pretty obvious what bills are going to come into conversation before that even happens. And so as session is starting in 1964, a public announcement comes out that there is going to be a freedom march on Frankfurt in March of 1964. This is about halfway through session at that point, and they wanted to really make a critical point that not only was the bill that was introduced weak, but that ultimately a Civil Rights Act needed to be passed in the state of Kentucky. And this was 2 years after MLK's March on Washington. So as the Allied Organization for Civil Rights in Louisville is starting the planning process and working with local organizers, most of whom were women here in Frankfort, they want to bring in folks who are heavy hitters on the national stage. And they do just that. They bring in Martin Luther King Jr. and professional baseball player Jackie Robinson. And in doing so, their goal of the march is to have a mass demonstration that appeals to authority. So they state that any large organizational march like this has a twofold purpose: to educate the public at large to the plight of the Negro, heightening the participants' conceptions of political action, and developing their political consciousness. So as they start to organize this march, this organization out of Louisville, or the branch out of Louisville for the AOCR, they are working with the NAACP chapter here, including notably Helen Holmes. So she begins to work with other organizers who are here in Frankfort to help bring this march into fruition. And as I said, most of them are women. To hear directly from some of the organizers and descendants of the organizers, I really recommend watching the very short documentary video from Joanna Hay that is available on that Google site that's linked in the description. It really details an oral history of the people who worked hard to make this march happen, specifically the women organizers who were more or less lost to history until this project on the March on Frankfurt began several years ago. So, as they're starting to organize this march, what they're really considering is the best way to bring together the largest group of people possible. They know that MLK's March on Washington 2 years prior had over 250,000 people, and they hoped that something similar here in Frankfort would bring another mass group of people. So the march organizers worked really hard to lobby the state government leading up to the march. So on February 25th, B.T. Holmes and Jack Robb, another prominent organizer in the NAACP, joined the Louisville AOCR chair, Frank Stanley Jr., who was the editor and publisher of a magazine known as the Louisville Defender, and also Reverend Olaf Anderson, a white Presbyterian minister, and Reverend W.J. Hodge, an African-American minister. And they decided to meet with Governor Breathitt to explicitly discuss the march, as well as the legislation they hoped would pass. The governor announced that he would meet with them in Frankfort on February 27th of 1964, and that he would also meet with an additional 200 priests, rabbis, and ministers to discuss the morality and the religious consequences of passing this type of civil rights legislation. And he also agreed more formally to meet with the leaders of civil rights activism groups on March 5th to discuss the bill immediately following the conclusion of the march. Because the march was held here in Frankfort, a lot of the logistical work to make it happen was undertaken by people here in Frankfort. So BT and Helen Holmes worked very hard on it, as did Jack Robb, and they wanted to make sure that they had podiums, electrical support, loudspeakers on light poles along the routes. They wanted to have concession stands with different lunches and refreshments, parking for private cars and commercial buses in case people were coming in from out of town and from the region. And they needed to make sure that everybody had a mark of identification indicating their placement in the march, as well as their signage, bumper stickers, whatever that they needed in order to ensure that they were demarked as people participating in the march as peaceful protesters. They also recruited local choirs and bands from high schools as well as from K-State, and he made sure that any local church held a service at 9 a.m. the morning of the march in order to bring a sense of spirituality to this overall organization. So taken together, this organization around making the march happen was intricate. It was not spontaneous. It was thought out. It was detailed. It was intentional. And the path and direction of the march from 2nd Street up Capitol Avenue was also intentional. It was meant to garner as many people as possible, to bring much needed notoriety, and to raise the level of the stakes around having this legislation pass. So the march was growing closer, and many newspapers started to publish that it was happening, and the advertisements read like this. You missed this one, the Washington March being pictured, but you shall not fail to, but you should not fail to march on Frankfort. It's not too late to participate. Organize a carload, busload, or join one. No American who believes in freedom can miss the march on Frankfort. And these type of advertisements worked. Motorcades came in from all of the major cities in Kentucky, including Lexington, Louisville, Danville, Paducah, Bowling Green, and Governor Breathitt even allowed heads of different departments and state officials and state employees to attend the march and rally if they wanted to. Students, although it was stated they were allowed to miss classes, I've heard from several people who lived during this time period who said that they actually had to skip out of class in order to attend the march. Specifically, one person talks about wanting to meet Jackie Robinson more than anything, and so skipping school in order to go. And there were over 100 different news organizations brought in to cover the march. And as with any protest of any kind, it was also expected that there would be demonstrators who were protesting against the march happening. And this did occur. Predominantly people from Louisville and Lexington, about 200 or so, came in the night before the march in order to set up and demonstrate against it. However, if you see photographs from the march, you'll not really see them in any pictures because they weren't as present on the day of. They just protested the night before, and then they weren't around as much on the day. So the morning of the march, Jackie Robinson and MLK arrived at the Louisville airport and were driven to Frankfort by Georgia Davis Powers, who was one of the march organizers and the first woman and first Black person to be elected to the Senate in the Kentucky General Assembly. And this happened in 1967, so several years following the march. So she picked both of them up and brought them to Frankfort with a police escort. Once they arrived in Frankfort, they joined the incredibly popular music trio Peter, Paul, and Mary, who entertained the crowd singing "Let My People Go." And for what it's worth, Peter, Paul, and Mary have a very strong Louisville connection, so having them here was not completely without reason. Also attending the march was Dr. Ralph Abernathy, who worked with Dr. King to plan the Montgomery bus boycott, and several other local leaders who were involved with Dr. King in a number of different protests and marches also attended the event. The thing that became the issue of the march was that the weather was not cooperating. It was cold, it was windy, it was rainy, and it was a march in Kentucky. Didn't matter. Organizers did have a moment of fear that not many people were going to show up, but in fact the opposite happened, and thousands and thousands and thousands of people, there were over 10,000 marchers who came to this rally in order to garner support and attention for the passing of this legislation. Reports indicate that about 10 to 15% of these 10,000 people were people who were white, or at least white appearing. And that is worth noting because it had bipartisan support, it had biracial support, it had support from people of multiple different backgrounds. And that's key. The entire program for the series of events of the march itself, like the program once the march concluded at the state capitol, is on display at the Capital City Museum. So you can see what happened once they reached the Capitol steps itself. But what is really worth noting is that at the conclusion of the march, Governor Breathitt did hold true to his word. But what's really interesting is that he did not join the march, but his 15-year-old daughter did. So she participated in the march, and to quote her, she says, "I'm marching because I feel the Negro should have full rights. The Negro is a human." This is what she told reporters the day of the march. And after the march concluded, Governor Breathitt met with Dr. King and other leaders to issue a statement that applauded the marchers' dedication and enthusiasm, particularly in spite of the bad and foul weather that morning. And even though he supported the march in concept and was verbally supporting the march happening, he also stated that he was still going to fully support the weaker of the bills that had been introduced into the General Assembly. So he was not going to stand behind the stronger bill, but instead he was going to do the weaker of the bills. So members of the Kentucky General Assembly, which did not break session while the march was going on, were more outspoken than Breathitt was. There were several members of the Kentucky General Assembly who did not appreciate that the march was happening and actually found it to be distasteful. They didn't appreciate that kind of pressure, and they felt as though to have this march happen while this bill was in conversation was, for use of a more contemporary word, sort of tacky. And this delayed the ultimate passing of the legislation, and by March 14th, both bills, the weak and the stronger bill, had actually been so delayed in conversation that the Louisville Courier reported that the bills were dead, that they were not going to pass, and they would not be seen during that session period. The editorial that was published in the Courier-Journal really found fault with both the General Assembly and the governor, stating that prejudice, complacency, political cowardice, political ineptness all contributed to the death of civil rights legislation in Frankfort. Those members of the House Rules Committee who refused to let the measure come to vote must bear most of the blame. So deciding that more action was needed, a few days later on March 23rd, a hunger strike was held in the state capitol's building's House Gallery. And there were a few strikers who were there, so 23 in total, and within a few days it became 32. They wore signage saying, "Give me freedom or death," and that they would not leave until the bill was passed. And this move, the hunger strike specifically, generated a lot of support as well. And it brought people, at least verbally supporting them, using telegrams from around the United States to say that they supported this and that they supported the actions that the hunger strike was taking to help the bill pass. No one thought by the end of March that the bill held any water, that there was any chance that any bill regarding civil rights legislation was going to happen. And they really felt as though that it was, to quote the Louisville newspaper, the CJ, that it was dead beyond recall. And they said that the strikers needed to go ahead and step down because it didn't matter. However, 104 hours later, after this article and editorial are coming out about the failure of the Kentucky government, Governor Breathitt promises to call a special session to convene the Kentucky General Assembly on civil rights-related issues. Even though it was stalling in the General Assembly, it looked really promising that multiple laws were going to be introduced here in the state of Kentucky. And by July 2nd, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, on a federal, national level, is signed by President Johnson. And this mandated equality in access to public accommodations, and also said that the access to public accommodations provided desegregation of schools and other public facilities, and also made employment discrimination illegal. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act passed, which outlawed discriminatory voting practices, which were adopted in southern states during the Civil War. Things like you had to own a certain amount of property, or you had to pass like a certain level of reading to be able to vote. Those were all taken away. So although Governor Breathitt and his promise for a special session to discuss civil rights was stated, it did not occur. So he did attempt to call it, but the passage of federal legislation in 1965 is ultimately what led to the state legislature to meet in 1966 and begin the real conversation of passing a bill here in Kentucky. So the good news in all of this is that the bill that ultimately was introduced here in Kentucky was the first piece of legislation introduced after the governor's budget bill in 1966. So the budget bill came out, then immediately the first bill is a bill regarding civil rights in the state of Kentucky. And This bill was a strong, powerful civil rights bill that had an excellent chance of passing due to the passing of federal legislation a year before. And critically, they felt that this bill that was introduced here in Kentucky extended the coverage of the Civil Rights Act and allowed for a stronger take on equality here in the state of Kentucky. So this was a huge deal, and to be an even bigger deal, woohoo! The bill was introduced in January 4th of 1966, and it was enacted in January 27th of that same year. Legislature also voted to repeal the 62-year-old segregation day law and the 74-year-old separate coach law. So on July 1st, 1966, the Kentucky Civil Rights Act became law. And among the provisions of the Civil Rights Act were the prohibition of discriminatory advertising in connection with employment, public accommodations, and real estate transactions, a requirement for businesses to post notice of compliance with the law, and procedures for initiating complaints. In 1968, the act was then amended to prohibit housing discrimination, and in 1972, the act was amended again to prohibit employment discrimination because of sex and age between 40 and 65. Then in 1972, additional amendments removed provisions of the earlier act, which exempted barbershops, beauty parlors, family-owned boarding houses, and private clubs. So after the act was passed, the original act, the Kentucky Commission on Civil Rights or Human Rights distributed 14,000 posters to businesses across the state with instructions to display them, which said, "Welcome. The Kentucky Civil Rights Act of 1966 requires that every person receive full and equal service in business establishments without discrimination because of race, color, religion, or national origin. It is our policy to comply fully with that law." So this bill passing in 1966 is a huge deal. And I don't want to undermine its critical nature in our state, because in 1966, after this was passed, Kentucky becomes the first southern state to pass any civil rights legislation as a state. So there's the federal law, great, but Kentucky paved the way for other southern states to pass legislation that would also close the gap between racial inequality in ways that had not been done before, specifically in southern states where Jim Crow policies were still enacted. And of note, in the 1960s, specifically 1968, MLK is assassinated, which furthers conversations on desegregation, racial equality, and racial violence or violence against Black people. And I don't want to say that the passing of this bill in 1966 makes everything hunky-dory, that there's no problems, that there's no instances of racial violence, that there's no need for continued legislation to close the gap on racial discrimination and race inequality. I am not saying that in the slightest. What I am saying is that without the March on Frankfort in 1964, which brought over 10,000 people into the state capitol in order to protest for equal rights in the state of Kentucky, we would not see the continued desire and push for legislation in 1966 that would be so strong. And to have such a strong bill pass after such a weak one was the favored one is significant. It's a big deal. And the protesters and the people who were lobbying for these bills in Frankfort were the ones who really made it happen. And a lot of those people, the organizers, the folks who were really pushing for these things to happen, it's worth noting that they were predominantly Black folk and they were predominantly women. So that unknown and unrecognized labor is something that's been acknowledged in recent years and is critical as historians to look back on and say these people who made this happen are worth discussing and remembering, and their legacy is worth bringing back into our present. So if we fast forward from 1964 to 2014, 50 years after the first March on Frankfort, a second historical reenactment march is initiated here in Frankfort, Kentucky. And it doesn't have the same push for legislation that the first march did. However, it does call into our contemporary moment the reason why this march was happening. We can't forget or pretend that 1964 was hundreds of years ago. It was in 2014, it was 50 years ago. And that was really recent. There are folks who I interact with on a regular basis who were alive during the original march, who remember it happening. It is something that is very much in the lived realities of people who we all know here in town. And so to have a reenactment march in 2014 was a big deal, and it also brought hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people into Frankfort to reenact it. So for the 60th anniversary in 2024, we did a similar reenactment march. And it's hard to believe that this was 2 years ago. It feels like it was just yesterday, because the museum had the honor of being the starting place for the march. So that's not historically accurate by any means, but we worked with our city partners, specifically Blair Hecker, in order to ensure that the march began at the museum, because we have the exhibit of the original photographs from the MLK March on Frankfort, as well as the souvenir programs that were distributed at the event, as well as we are the only repository/home for the videos that were produced by Joanna Hay, and they're on display in the museum now. So it was really cool to be a part of that march at that time. And also we had a lot of cool programs to coincide with that march, including making protest signs outside the museum. We had a MLK, Martin Luther King Jr. reenactor give a speech inside the museum. And we also had opportunities for school children across various high schools, middle schools, grade schools, the whole kit and caboodle, as well as the universities, to interact with history in a way that they might not otherwise get to engage with it. And the entire march was a huge deal. We had thousands of people come out for it. And it was also kind of a gray, like bleary day, which fit in the historical aspect of the entire thing. And the march ended at the Capitol. So it was a really fascinating and powerful way to celebrate that moment of our history. And we can't let it fall behind us. We can't forget about the role of someone like Martin Luther King Jr. in a community like Frankfort, because he had an impact here, and it's impossible to deny that he did. His presence here in Frankfort brought conversation and much needed consideration to inequality in ways that I think a lot of people hadn't really thought about before, and brought national attention to an issue that everyone felt and dealt with in various capacities back in the 1960s. And again, this is a very abridged version of a very long story. And Frankfort's ties to the statewide stage, as well as the national stage, for the passing of civil rights law are ones that we need to consider as we continue throughout our year and as we think about our civic engagement here in Frankfort. These folks who organized this march, these Black women, Helen Holmes in particular, Georgia Davis Powers, they brought this march to fruition through their desire for civic engagement here in Frankfort in the 1960s, to make a change in their community, a positive change that affected not only their lives, but the lives of the people they love. So I encourage you all, as we think about Martin Luther King Jr. and his impact on the United States this week, I encourage you all to think about your own impact in your community and the ways in which the actions you're taking today could have a lasting effect on everybody that you know around you. And I think otherwise, I hope you will come to the museum. We're open Monday through Saturday from 10 to 4. I hope you will check out Joanna Hay's project on the MLK March and the oral histories associated with that march. It is powerful and it will move you. And the city also worked with Joanna to produce a digital walking tour of the march, so you can go to specific stops that were pivotal on the march, or photographs that we have of the march. And if you are someone who wants to do some history or historical research on the march, please come by the museum. We would love to help you. Send us an email, reach out to us on Facebook, whatever you want to do. But I hope you all have a good day and a reflective day. And thank you so much for tuning in.
Speak